Good morning, Laleh, and thank you very much for giving us some time to talk to us at the Mint.
It's very exciting to be speaking to you about the book.
Well, that's brilliant. So I wanted to start very much with, where did this book come from? What's its incubation? What was the inspiration, and so forth for writing it?
So there's a longer history, a longer story behind that, and that is that in 2012, 2013, I started researching logistics, so maritime logistics in the Middle East. And in doing so, what I was really interested in was the big ships, the really kind of awesome looking container ships and tankers and things like that. And there's a lot of material available, but nobody had really actually looked at this stuff in a way that was engaging and interesting and not hyper technical. You would find all sorts of things in, for example, transportation management journals, but not anything that made the story of the emergence of these modern ports in the Middle East really kind of enticing and open and legible, actually, to a wider, intelligent audience who might be interested in these things. And so when I started doing that research, of course, it's impossible to do this kind of research in the Middle East, or at least in the Arabian Peninsula, without also talking about oil, because a lot of the because a number of the ports that end up emerging on the Arabian Peninsula, but of course not all, had to emerge in response to the need to actually bring in construction materials, various other kinds of things that were needed, equipment that was needed for creating an oil industry. And of course, the other instances where such ports were constructed was because of imperial or strategic reasons. First the British, and then of course the US. And so it was fascinating for me to see some of this. And I mean, of course, my father was an oil geologist in Iran. I grew up in Iran until 1985, until I left as a 16, 17-year-old. And so oil was wrapped up in our lives in my childhood, and I have an undergraduate degree in chemical engineering for my sins. Uh, Yes, and so it just seemed like a natural progression to that. But the book itself started out of a series of essays that I had written online for different kinds of outlets. So some of them were from the London Review of Books, but some of them for other magazines that publish online. And when I was offered to put them together, I ended up writing some new things for it. I ended up updating and adapting some of those essays. And it was very clear to me that a kind of a theme and consistent kind of thread emerged through those essays, which of course points to the fact that I have an obsession with oil now. And so that's how the book emerged as it did. But one of the other things I think that was quite important was that when I wrote the book that came out of the logistics project, that was my third major authored book, and that was called Sinews of Foreign Trade. I just really enjoyed not writing in an academic register. I really enjoyed writing for a larger audience, in part because I'm a left-brained engineer. I wanted to be able to explain how things worked, and so explaining how things worked emerged as the constant theme between both sinews and extractive capitalism, but also just being able to write in a way that doesn't have that cumbersome scaffolding of academic writing was very liberating. And it's something that I hope for the rest of my academic career, the next, whatever, 10 or 15 years, if they don't keep pushing retirement age back, I hope to continue doing as long as I can.
Uh, it's interesting, you started out as an engineer, and I suppose explaining how things work from an engineering perspective, obviously the mechanisms and the technical, but you switched to explaining things, how things work from a economic viewpoint. So when did that switch happen? And that sort of interest of the sort of power, politics, economics, etc. coming?
So, when I started my academic work, my first two books actually have to do with the role of political violence. So, the first one about what has been done to Palestinians, and also the ways in which Palestinians themselves have resisted. And the second one, which I wrote after the war on terror, is about counterinsurgency practices of the U.S. and Israel. But all of this time, because I'm a daughter of a few good Marxists, a couple of good Marxists, I was always interested in political economy. But I was also quite wary of going down a route because the kind of Marxism that I was exposed to in a large measure in the cauldron of the post-revolutionary or pre and post-revolutionary Iran was a somewhat of a doctrinaire Marxism that didn't kind of that sort of looked at stages of whatever different modes of production. They all came right after another, and then it was the introduction to actually a much richer corpus of excuse me, to a much richer corpus of pardon me, Marxist thinking that didn't necessarily fit that kind of a doctrinaire stages of development sort of emergence that was like, wow, I can actually look at things and explain them. So, you hear about even Rosa Luxemburg when you're younger, but you don't get to read her, or you hear about, of course, Gramsci, but you don't get to read him, and so you start reading these um, seminal figures, these incredibly significant figures, and then you realize that Rosa, for example, wrote very early on, about the way that sort of imperial violence was inseparable from capital accumulation in ways that was incredibly familiar. I mean, her book on accumulation of capital actually has like chapters on Egypt and Argentina, the global South, and the research that it was based on. A friend has done some research on, the sources were actually people that knew something about those places. So there was something really quite attractive about that. So when it came time to do the ports research, I originally was actually interested more in fact, the application for funding that I put forward to get the money I needed to do the research actually focused mostly on the sort of the military fungibility of a lot of these infrastructures. It's impossible to talk about transportation or oil or almost anything in the Middle East without thinking about the role of US military in those. And so originally that was the intent, but of course, the more that you research, it becomes clear that that political economy aspect has to be incorporated into it. So commerce, in the case of logistics, and of course, oil, energy, fueling, not only of course, the world's military bodies, but also, of course, the economy. And so that is how I came to the political economy. And in some ways, of course, I got a my PhD came from a US university, which I'm ashamed to say which one it is now, given how shittily, excuse the language, they have treated their students. But Columbia. But when you do a PhD in the US, you have to have like 2 3 years of coursework, and so I actually had quite a substantial exposure to a lot of works of political economy. I wasn't coming at it as a complete knave, but it was also a learning curve and an experience and a very fun one because you're a student. You're being a student. There are particular pleasures in it, and I was a student in that field.
And you talk about extractive capitalism. Is the non-extractive capitalism? Is this a
I suppose it depends on how you're thinking about extraction, because of course, if we think about capitalism as around the question of labor, the ways in which surplus labor becomes capital, all capitalism is extractive. But I was particularly also interested in the way that land or nature can also become part of this element of extraction. There's a really wonderful book by Fernando Coronil written in the 1990s about the oil industry in Venezuela. And he is wonderful about the way that he talks about the sort of the exploitation of nature and how it needs to be brought into all calculuses around the accumulation of capital, and particularly around the unequal accumulation of capital between the global north and the global south, because of the ways in which that process of extraction of natural resources works in the global south and has done so since, the start of the sort of modern industrial age. So that was part of what was of interest to me.
Well, can we talk about sand? Because
Yes.
oil, people know all about oil, but sand is something maybe that people are not so familiar with. And so I was very interested that you look particularly at the sand economy, if that's right, and explain, well, how is that exploited? How does it work, the sand economy?
So yeah, oil we all hear about, right? There are wars for oil, there are tankers, there's Exxon Valdez breaks open here and there, or you have that BP horrendous incident in the Gulf of Mexico, etc. But sand we don't hear about because it's such a sort of, it seems like such a pedestrian kind of commodity, right? But if you are working on ports, or if you have looked at construction, what becomes really clear is that in order for any kind of construction, modern construction to be done of sort of these large scale infrastructures, whether it's buildings or bridges or whatever, concrete is one of the fundamental and most important kinds of elements of those construction. But in order for concrete to be made, you need to have cement, which itself is kind of processed earth in a particular way. Um, and you need to have aggregate. Aggregate is a combination of pebbles and sand. And it can't be any kind of pebbles or sand, because one of the things that was fascinating to me was that the countries flanking the sort of the empty quarter in the Arabian Peninsula, this massive desert, cannot use the desert sand because the desert sand is too evenly, because of wind erosion, it is too even in its size. And what you need in order for concrete to hold together is sand that but has both grains that are of unequal size, but that also the grains are of kind of uneven or asymmetrical shape, because that allows for sort of the molecular level for concrete to hold together. And so you need to bring sand that has been eroded by water, and that means beaches and rivers. And so there's an entire economy of countries that have lots of rivers. So, for example, Indochina, those massive deltas of the various kinds of rivers. These are riparian states, or beaches that are particularly exposed to that kind of erosion. So, for example, beaches on the west coast of Africa, which get the very kind of tumultuous Atlantic waves, Atlantic surfs. And so there's an entire economy in that, some of it regulated, but a huge amount of it unregulated. So a story that other colleagues that work on Southeast Asia have written about is, for example, that you get Singapore shows its sand imports from Cambodia being, let's say, X millions of tons, or let's say X hundreds of thousands of tons from Cambodia. But Cambodia export numbers for sand shows X tens of thousands of tons of sand being exported. So in between those reported numbers is obviously a lot of sand that has been illegally harvested. And of course, the illegal harvest of sand is really environmentally detrimental, because if you're harvesting sand from the rivers, you're dredging rivers, which changes the turbidity, the amount of suspended matter in the water, increases it, which makes it very difficult for river flora and fauna to sustain themselves. It changes the flow of water in rivers, so it actually increases the flow, but also the violence with which it flows. So it can potentially destroy bridges and other infrastructures over rivers and things like that. And on beaches, of course, if you bring in a bulldozer and dig up all the sand, is what you're doing is you're exposing the area behind the beach to further erosion. And so there's an entire economy of sand harvesting, which is actually quite violent in a lot of places in Senegal and India. Activists that have tried to stop that kind of illegal harvest, which is often done by you need equipment for doing that, and therefore there is quite a bit of capital investment in that. Therefore, it's not just some random guy coming and collecting a bushel of sand. It's somebody that has bulldozers and trucks and access to export. And so local activists that have tried to protect the rivers and beaches have actually been shot and killed over this. And so I wanted to write about this because, of course, the building, Dubai, Singapore, Hong Kong, a lot of these major city states that grow gleaming out of their environments are dependent on that kind of a sand harvest. And so it was important for me to talk about that.
And what are the companies? Are they part of great conglomerates? Are they Western multinational? What sort of?
I mean, any construction company that actually is involved in construction will need some of this sand. And then there are, of course, some places where they bring this material in themselves because they already have their networks. And there could be any. They could be major conglomerates, but they could also be intermediary companies that are small companies you've never heard of that actually have the connections, for example, in India's, river basins to harvest that material, or go to Senegal or to Morocco to collect that material. So you've got the big conglomerations that are hungry, that are ravenous for sand. And every construction company needs sand, basically. If you use concrete, you need sand. But there's also other elements of this that's interesting. So if you use fracking, you also need fracking sand, and that's even a more specific grade of sand that you need to have in order to do fracking. Because what they do is they flush the earth's fissures with a kind of a mud and chemical mixture, and that mud is created through using fracking sand. And so you have these uses that are unclear to people and opaque and intransparent and devastating, and so environmentally devastating. So that's what I really wanted to write about.
Yes, it's sort of strange we don't hear about that. I suppose it's just because I suppose people haven't. Are the big NGOs at all campaigning on that sort of?
I mean, there are both NGOs and environmental. I mean, I think UN's environmental body was one of the earliest to sort of sound the alarm about this in the 1990s and then again in the 2000s. But it is also because people it's not a commodity that has a huge value per volume, right? Oil has one of the, is a very high value per volume in comparison with some of the other kinds of material that is transported in bulk. But sand isn't. It's not a very well, it's extremely environmentally valuable, but in terms of the value the market places on it, it's not. And so people don't think about it. They, sand, why don't you go to the desert and collect some?
So we have obviously for some time and developed since colonial times, etc. These extractive colonialism.
Yes.
How do you think that's been affected by the sort of current events? I suppose the Trump challenging international law, sort of is this going to just get worse? Is it going to feed into conflicts?
So we have an entire, I mean, there is a very long history of these kinds of extraction, sort of capitalist extractive policies vis-a-vis a lot of the countries of the global south. So I quote the amazing Walter Rodney, who wrote a book that is simply does not age, that does not get old, called How Europe Underdeveloped Africa, in which he talks about how all the railroads from Africa actually bypassed some of the largest population centers and led down to the sea. So they went from the mines, whether it was copper or timber centers or you name it, iron ore, etc., down to the sea, where these extracted commodities were loaded onto ships and sent out. Of course, in the Middle East, that extracted commodity ended up becoming oil. But then in what we're seeing, I think the changes are perhaps not related so much to Trump as it is related to the transitions that we're seeing, a lot more structural changes that we're seeing, where a lot of the kind of politics that continues to play out around oil is now being also played out around the rare earths, which are like, for example, lithium, which are needed for electrical kind of batteries, whether they're for cars or for, sort of storing solar or other kinds of renewable powers. And so you see those you see those kinds of tensions developing around that. And one of the things that has been really interesting to bring it back to Trump is to follow that is that in Trump's trade war with China, one of the things that China has done as an immediate retaliation very quietly is that they actually have very large stores of some of these needed rare earths, including copper and nickel and various other kinds of things. And they have actually put an export ban on those or limitation on the export of those materials, particularly to the US. And so and nickel was also another factor in the US-Ukraine war because both the US, not the US, Ukraine, Russia, Ukraine war, because both Russia primarily, but both Russia and Ukraine are actually also producers of some of these rare earths. So what we're seeing is that extractive politics is now playing out in those forms. In Latin America, for example, in some of the Latin American countries that also had oil, like Ecuador, you see again some of that politics playing out, including with the ways that the indigenous communities in those countries end up being caught in the crossfire between a state that wants to extract income from its sources, the capitalist large conglomerates that have been in operation there, and have been actually even before the invention, even before the transition. I mean, the coup that overthrew Salvador Allende in Chile was about copper. And ITT, a US-based company. And so these kinds of politics are playing out again in forms that are familiar, but with different commodities.
I was just wondering, I suppose, that one of the hallmarks of, I suppose, Trump and, well, Putin and various is the ignoring international law or the degradation of international law and so reducing the ability for, I suppose, the world to say, well, this is not a good thing, the way things are being treated, etc., etc. But do you think that actually it's not much difference because they weren't really followed anyway? So yeah, it may be a little bit, the fight for these minerals, etc., might be a little bit more violent and aggressive, but it's always been like that sort of thing.
I'm afraid after writing my book on counterinsurgency, my trust in international law was eroded. And then now, of course, watching the Israeli genocide of Palestinians and the way the EU, which at least has sort of for decades has touted international law, the way that EU just falls in line behind the US's support for Israel, tells me about the hollowness of some of the claims around international law. But when it comes to political economy, it's also worth mentioning that the moment that the nationalization of oil started happening, and there were instances of it before the post Second World War era. So obviously 1917, the actual date was 1919. Russian Revolution, the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia, led to the nationalization of oil there. One of the companies that was nationalized in Azerbaijan was actually the Nobels of the Nobel Peace Prize. They owned one of the largest sort of oil companies. They were a Swedish family that owned one of the largest oil companies in Azerbaijan. And then, of course, in 1938, 39 in Mexico, when oil was nationalized there. So that those two nationalizations actually led to a whole series of, long before the UN came about, to a whole series of international efforts to limit the ability of global South states or states that weren't part of these the sort of the European West, to limit their ability to nationalize oil, but even also to do things to protect their own citizens from the depredations of international companies. And what that translated to, what was in the post-Second World War era, was a whole series of mechanisms often associated with the global financial, with the transnational financial institutions, that limited the ability of the countries of the global South and sort of newly independent countries to protect themselves. Among these, one of these bodies that I think everybody should follow because it's so pernicious, it's called the State Company State Investor Dispute
Mechanism.
Resolution
Yeah.
Mechanism
Yeah.
of the World Bank, which, when it was first established in the 1950s, 60s, was explicitly intended to reduce the sovereignty of states over their economic resources and to protect the rights of international investors, which of course at that point were mostly European or North Atlantic countries. And that mechanism ended up becoming far more significant after the end of the Cold War. And so that mechanism, I think The Guardian 10, 15 years ago did a kind of a report on this, where they found that in absolutely no instances has this dispute mechanism worked to the benefit of the states of the global South. It always works to the benefit of the investors. And this actually, now that some of these investors are in the global South, so for example, Dubai Ports World is headquartered out of Dubai in the United Arab Emirates, and it receives lots of port concessions elsewhere in the world. Now they actually have investments in the global north. So Dubai Ports World, for example, runs ports in Belgium and the Netherlands and the UK. And even in those instances, so where even the countries are in the global north, the dispute resolution mechanism rules on behalf of Dubai Ports World rather than the port companies. And it often comes around to questions of collective bargaining or environmental protection. And so labor and nature, again and again and again, you go back to that, where the protection of these things is circumvented by these international institutions that are intended to protect us all, but of course they don't. They protect capital.
And is there any hope from the fact that the world is becoming more multipolar as such, that could this allow the global South at all to sort of bargain with, who they get into bed with and on what basis, etc.? Or do you think that each of the polar sort of power points will just become more violent and more aggressive and so on, and the global South won't really get anything out of it?
Well, I don't know, because I mean, people talk about multipolarity, but in fact, the US is, the global metropole right now. Its military is larger than the next nine countries put together. It is the richest country in the world, and it is the country that, alongside the other North Atlantic countries, sets the rules and standards for almost everything that happens in the political economy. So the control, and very significantly, of course, the US controls the financial conduits through which money flows, and global trade is really primarily denominated in the US dollar, which gives the US what Keynes called the exorbitant privilege.
Yeah.
And this exorbitant privilege is one the US is going to protect no matter what. So when Trump started doing stuff to shake that dollar dominance, in fact, his handlers in his administration came back and said, no, we want to protect that dollar privilege. So there's been some attempts to, of course, challenge that, the BRICS and now the expanded BRICS, where they were thinking about putting into place an alternative to SWIFT. If anybody has ever sent money internationally, they know that there's this thing called SWIFT number that you have to have, which is essentially the conduit, the channel through which this money is moved. And SWIFT is controlled by the US. I mean, the US sets the sort of parameters for its operation. And the BRICS are trying to create a kind of an alternative channel for that, and it becomes really, really quite difficult. So the ability to do that is quite limited. And in terms of, I mean, of course, China is you know, the world's factory, which you would think would give it a degree of power. But of course, China also, the foreign currency which has in its reserves is the dollar. It's the largest holder of dollar outside of some sovereign wealth funds. And so it's kind of like, you know, you see it being a kind of a slowly moving towards a multipolar world, but we are not there yet. And I think the sooner we recognize the way that the US has maintained that both hegemony and incredibly violent dominance, the better our strategies of resistance.
Yes, and just as a sort of final question, and given your Iranian heritage and current events,
Yeah,
and obviously we've seen a escalating sort of violence from Israel backed by the
yeah,
US, and this is the latest incident.
yeah,
Um, do you have any thoughts about what's going
yeah.
on next?
Absolutely. You want me to pontificate? I will pontificate. I love pontificating. But I mean, Israel is what Alexander Haig, who was Secretary of Defense for Reagan, Israel is what was called the largest unsinkable aircraft carrier for the United States. Biden himself, multiple times in the 1980s, but more recently, has also said things like, if Israel didn't exist, we would have to invent it. An imperial force, like the one that the United States is, often requires kind of proxy states or places where that they can essentially depend on to become gendarmes for the region. Iran, before the revolution, was one of these gendarmes. The monarchical regime was in cahoots with the United States. But the thing is, and I think it's important to recognize that these gendarmes, these local the proxies overseas, often act actually incredibly, they can act with some degree of autonomy. For example, the way that we see that is the way that it seems impossible to stop Israel from doing the kind of violence it's visiting upon Palestinians. By some estimates, 400,000 people have been killed in Gaza, and there seems and the Palestinians who are coming to seek aid because they're starving are being shot as if they're in a shooting gallery. So things are horrendous, and I think in part it's because it's because the larger the sort of the larger in if it may not be spelled out intent, but the larger setting for US imperial control is the kind of chaos that would require an external power to control it. So my PhD supervisor was a sociologist called Charles Tilly, and he has a very famous essay that he wrote in the 1980s. He said the state is a protection racket. They put you in the way of harm, and then they say, give us your taxes so we can protect you. And this is precisely what is happening. So, you know, the US and its kind of little Satan disciples like Israel and other local powers put the rest of the region under, you know, into the way of harm in extraordinarily violent sorts of ways, and then the US claims to come in to rescue, to you know, bring stability back to the region with its B-2 bombers and bunker busters. And And this is precisely what is happening now, because also the other element is that that Israel, as a settler colonial state, cannot survive in the region without having all of its largest enemies completely de-developed and defanged. And of course, the only remaining enemy that Israel has is Iran, really, in the region. And I think that what we're seeing is part of that. I think what they hadn't bargained for, and I think this is in, is that. Despite all of the campaigns of assassination of civilians, despite the sort of the indiscriminate bombings, although they claim that it's targeted, but indiscriminate bombings of civilian areas in order to terrorize Iranians into whatever regime change or whatever fantasy they might have, I don't think they had quite bargained for A, the fact that people rallied around the flag, and B, that Iran, despite the assassination of many of its top leadership of the military, of both the military and the Revolutionary Guards, they're two parallel bodies essentially. Despite the assassination of those leadership, had the capacity to respond. And I think that given that Israel is already economically shaky because of this 2-year war that it has waged, because of the brain drain that is happening, where Israelis with skills are trying to get the hell out of there and go somewhere where they're not fighting, and because of the fact that its economy is suffering because it has blocked out the Palestinians from the West Bank that actually worked in a lot of the kinds of menial jobs or low-wage jobs, I shouldn't say menial jobs, low-wage jobs that otherwise they wouldn't be able to fill. These are all affecting the Israeli economy. So I think that the ceasefire that we might hold shakily is in part precisely because I don't think that Israel thought that, I think they thought that they would have a cakewalk, and I don't think that they quite did. So, Trump may go and declare mission accomplished, but in fact, what they have done is unleash a kind of violence, echoes of which we will hear for, I don't know, years, possibly decades to come.
I suppose a bit like Bush standing on the ship and saying, you know, mission accomplished. Doesn't
That was precisely what I was trying to refer to. Yeah.
Absolutely. Well, thank you very much for
My pleasure.
fascinating to talk to you. And yes, good luck with your book and getting out there. And I hope you know, it gets to the audience that really need to read it.
Thank you very much. It's been lovely to talk to you, and I hope that we can meet in person at some point.